Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. We are going to spend most of the time talking about a very lengthy article, really a transcript from an interview from Politico with Fiona Hill today. It's an absolutely fabulous interview that has, goodness me, so much in it. Really, I wanted to highlight the entire thing, and the entire thing is very, very long. I'm going to do a lot of reading and talking about stuff. There will be a lot of talk about American politics. I will say that up front. I will try not to be kind of partisan, but treat it in an objective way, like this is happening, that's happening. Or look at it in terms of what Fiona Hill is saying and bringing her political opinions and kind of knowledge to the fore. We'll go first to there, and then we'll take it off in a connected direction. So Darren Massico just says of this, wisdom and eloquence as always from Fiona Hill, interview below. Amazing read. She summarized it all in one interview, and it is a really good interview, this. I know she might be slightly divisive for some. So Fiona Hill was involved in Trump's impeachment. She was called as a witness. She's a keen observer, not just of Russia and its leader, but also of American politics, having served in the White House as top advisor to both Democrats and Republicans, including Donald Trump. She was advisor there, and she is British, but pretty much, you know, I believe she lives in America and whatnot. Anyway, a lot to say about this, so let's get started. The first question: Ukraine is fighting the Russian invasion on several fronts, military, financial, political. In which of these areas is Ukraine winning, or is Russia? And she starts off by saying, look, if you see where they've come from and where they were at the beginning of 2022, if that's the start point, you know, militarily, and we look at what's happened over the last 2 years, we can actually say that Ukraine has won in terms of securing its independence and has won by fighting Russia to a standstill. So there are different metrics of measuring this, and I often talk about this kind of thing. You know, what are the objectives? Where are you starting? Where are you now? Blah, blah, blah. And it's incredible what Ukraine have done, really. We get bogged down with the kind of counteroffensive, not taking back as much territory as was hyped up, right? And that's kind of where she goes there. You know, now we're in a scenario where, having not succeeded in reaching the stated goals of the counteroffensive, we're basically positing that Ukraine has somehow lost the entire war. And that's dangerous to do, and it's easy to do, and there are lots of people with heads down, and that then feeds into Putin's narrative. It feeds into the people who are trying to detract Ukraine and talk them down and talk them into a negotiation, and that's dangerous. So Ukraine has succeeded so far, she says, because of massive military support from European allies and other partners. So in that regard, we've now reached a tipping point between whether Ukraine continues to win in terms of having sufficient fighting power to stave off Russia, or whether it actually starts to lose because it doesn't have the equipment, the heavy weaponry, the ammunition. That external support is going to be determinative. So we're at this tipping point, she says, and what do? It's up to us now. The future of Ukraine really is in our hands. And this is why it's really frustrating what's going on in the Congress, but it's frustrating what's going on in certain areas politically around the world, but particularly close to home in terms of Viktor Orban in Hungary, Robert Fico in Slovakia, certain elements here and there. But on the other hand, there are really positive messages coming out of Germany. You know, Emmanuel Macron saying positive things, and you know, the British and the Baltics and the Nordic states really standing very positively behind Ukraine, and not just in terms of rhetoric, but with a lot of money and a lot of assistance. So where America might be receding somewhat, Europe is starting to pick up some of that slack. Now, will that be enough? That's a big question. How about financial and diplomatic arenas? She says Ukraine has now become a domestic political issue in a whole range of countries. So we can talk about this in the United States, and she comes to talk about this at great length later. But let's just look at Europe. So not just here in the United States, but in countries like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Germany, and many more. And that's an issue where it's going to be very hard for Ukraine to win, because when you get into the transactional issues of domestic politics, and think about the southern border in the US here, and you're no longer thinking about national security or these larger imperatives, then Ukraine dies 1,000 deaths from all the transactional efforts that domestic politicians engage in. Most political constituents, no matter the country, can't really see beyond their own narrow interests. And this is where we can go and talk about the US and what representatives, the House of Representatives, are trying to do, because they, as I talked about before, senators work on a 6-year election cycle. House of Representatives, Congress people work on a 2-year election cycle. And therefore, they need to get elected in on what their base are arguing about on a daily basis. And if their base are being picked up, whipped up by sort of national domestic media that is, on the one hand, decrying this, well, on the one hand, putting down Ukraine, maybe subtly or explicitly, but on the other hand, whipping up, fomenting discord concerning, say, the southern border in the US, then those Congress people are going to be concentrating on that, and they'll be using, as they are, Ukraine as a political tool of leverage to get what they want, that they feel is more important to their base. So this is the transactional nature that it's talking about here. She's talking about here, and that doesn't only happen in the States, of course. And the argument is that people can't see beyond their kind of localized horizon. Now, that's not a criticism, that's just the reality of humans, right? But the problem is that we live in this global society where the US is the biggest player on that international stage. And when domestically you have the electorate that can't see that, or doesn't understand it, or doesn't understand its importance, then that can be really divisive in terms of having Ukraine prevail. So it's these domestic versus international agendas that are being played off against each other, and we'll come back to talk about that later in more detail. So what do you think Putin sees when he's watching the debate taking place in the US? So although we're going to talk about the details of that, let's talk about how Putin sees that. So he does see the entire battlefield of the military, financial, and political arenas tipping to his benefit. Putin really thinks that he's on the winning side. We've just seen in the last few weeks something that looks rather suspiciously like a preparatory victory tour around the Middle East, visiting the UAE, Saudi Arabia, stepping out again in polite company, preparing to go to other major meetings. And then the coverage in the Russian press, their commentators are crowing with glee. So think of all the propagandists we've seen over the last few weeks at the predicament of the Ukrainians, clapping their hands literally and figuratively about the peril for Ukraine in the US Congress. And then she goes on to talk about Iran and North Korea. Both see this as a kind of international opening for them. If Russia prevails on a battlefield, you can be sure that Iran and North Korea will get benefits from this. So it becomes a kind of a simplistic question, really, or even calculation, where do you want to see Iran and North Korea and China prevail? Do you want them to get stronger and stronger? Do you want them to see them arm themselves with nuclear weapons, like more and more? And we'll talk about nuclear proliferation a bit later. Like, if that's what you want, by all means, let Ukraine lose against Russia. Let Russia prevail. But if you're not a big fan of all those countries, all those dictatorships gaining more and more international power at the expense, in a zero-sum game, at the expense of US power, for example, if that scares you, then you need to be supporting Ukraine here. We already see Russia shifting its position on the Iranian nuclear front, and we also see Russia making a major shift in its relationship with Israel. Putin has gone from being a major supporter of Israel to now an opponent, and has switched from what was always very careful public rhetoric about Israel to pretty anti-Semitic statements. Putin never denigrated Jews in the past. On the contrary, he presented himself as a supporter of the Jewish population. This is a dramatic shift, and clearly because of Iran. So essentially, Putin's putting all his chips in with Iran, with the Middle East, and China. And Israel is now just firmly a kind of an American ally. And so, therefore, where it was very careful with Israel previously, now it's like, no, our chips are in with the other guys, because actually that's how this war has developed. It has pushed Russia closer to, or Russia's necessarily had to move itself closer to Iran and North Korea and this kind of axis of evil. And it's having to try and cozy up to the Middle East that has otherwise been somewhat neutral, but effectively, if you're talking about OPEC and the US isn't in OPEC and OPEC Plus, then these nations that are also possibly going to join BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, we see this growing polarization of the world where everyone is either having to go with US hegemony or some alternative hegemony. And, OPEC is naturally against the US in terms of oil and hydrocarbon market prices and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it's a dramatic shift, and clearly because of Iran, says Fiona Hill. Iran and Russia have become fused together now into conflict. So then if you see the Middle East expanding, or the Israel-Palestine conflict expanding into the Middle East, then Russia has pretty much taken sides there. China is not neutral either. So not only do we have North Korea, but we also have one of North Korea's major patrons, which is China. Although we have not seen China supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine in a way that North Korea and Iran have, China continues to give Putin a lot of economic, political, and moral support. China sees this as an opportunity to put pressure on the United States. China's also learning an awful lot of lessons from this war about how the US and Europe and other countries are likely to react in other contexts. If we step back and allow Ukraine to lose, well, are we going to do the same in the case of Taiwan? China is looking very closely at this war. South Korea, though, and Japan, on the other hand, are players that are getting increasingly involved, and they are positioned, against China in the Indo-Pacific. So, Japan has just given Ukraine a significant tranche, she says, of money, because they know only too well that a military failure for Ukraine is going to shift the entire balance in the Indo-Pacific. There's a lot riding on this Ukraine war. It isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. This is about the place of every nation in the world when considering what the power structures are going to be going forward. And people are picking sides, and Japan and South Korea are clearly on the side of Ukraine because they see Ukraine failing as being a severe issue for them going forward in terms of China. If China is flexing its muscles in the South China Sea, which it is, the Philippines at the moment, traditionally an ally of the US, with the US having armed forces bases in the Philippines. China is flexing its muscles against the Philippines, which is kind of a proxy war itself, in a sense, or proxy diplomatic conflict. If we allow Russia to win, we allow China to get greater and greater power across the globe. So, and she says, in answer to the question, you said a loss for Ukraine would shift the entire balance in the Indo-Pacific region. You mean a shift towards China? Yes, she says, it's highly likely that will be the case. And that's why Japan and South Korea are desperately trying to help out Ukraine, because they see the larger political implications of this. But it's not just China and Russia who are learning from this war. So are we. In terms of drone warfare, we need to be looking very carefully at this conflict. This way, the way that Putin has played the idea of using tactical nuclear weapons, the use of drones on the battlefield, the use of mines, the use of ships and blockades in the Black Sea, the difficulty of pushing forward in a counter-offensive against these deep entrenchments, how various military systems, including defensive equipment, actually perform in real time and conditions. We can see how effective our ATACMS were, for example, our Patriot batteries. This is, in a way, a proving ground for our own equipment. So, lots to be learned from this war. So what you're seeing here, she continues, is a Russian military build-up on the back of this war that will become a menace to its neighbours and those who don't have to be just the neighbours in Europe, but can be further afield. Remember, Japan still has a territorial dispute with Russia. This is where I'm particularly worried about how Russia is getting onto war footing. They are getting, and there's news I'll be bringing out tomorrow, how they are getting around loopholes and importing an absolute ton of electronic equipment that allows them to build up their stockpiles of weapons, arguably. And I'm worried that Russia's production capabilities and capacities far exceed what we were hoping would be the case, given all the sanctions that have been put in place. And yeah, I do worry about that. So how do you think Putin now would define a win for himself and for Russia? And she says, if the US doesn't pass a supplemental bill, that bill to approve aid to Ukraine, $106 billion, it includes all those other things as well, and we get this chorus of members of Congress calling for the US to pull away from Ukraine, Putin will be able to switch this around and say, there you go, the United States is an unreliable ally, the United States is not a world leader. And there will be a chilling effect for all of our other allies. In the past, Putin was actually, for example, approached by the Japanese and said, look, we can be your interlocutor with China, and the United States is not going to be there to assist you in a crunch. And that's certainly what this is going to look like. The Japanese, the South Koreans, the Vietnamese, others that we have bilateral treaties with are going to wonder, okay, the United States made such a push here to support Ukraine, along with other European members of NATO, and now they've just walked away from it. And you put that on top of Afghanistan and the withdrawal, also the withdrawal from Iraq, withdrawal from Syria, and a whole fraught history of United States interventions in the past 2 decades, and Putin will be able to present a pretty potent narrative about the US's inability to maintain its commitments and forfeiting its role as an international leader. So that becomes a major political win. And that's aside from the obvious win of being able to turn the tide on Ukraine, because Putin will now see an opportunity to partition Ukraine. The partition will be along the existing ceasefire lines. He'll start to push, and others will be pushing for a negotiation. We've already heard former President Trump saying he would solve the conflict in 24 hours, and many other senators and people who would be supporting Trump in an election basically saying we need to get this over with, pushing Ukraine towards the table. Now, Trump already said very publicly that he would trade land. We've got Vivek Ramaswamy very publicly saying that basically he would give Russia all that they're demanding of Ukraine, pretty much. So you have people in American politics who are willing to push this negotiation thing, and that is a win for Putin. It's just a win for Putin, obviously so. So that's not the position of the administration, to be very clear, this administration. And that's not the position of many in Congress and the Senate. But we've definitely got those voices. So for Putin, she says, he will see this as a very propitious moment to re-up the idea of negotiation for a ceasefire on his terms. And of course, we've got all the drama around the issue of the ceasefire in the Middle East. There may also be push from many other countries to say, let's stop. We need to focus on the disasters in Gaza. Let's just get Russia and Ukraine to put their war to one side. Putin's already playing into this, trying to get other countries to say, look, we're always dealing with Europe's problems. We need to be dealing with the Middle East here. This is more consequential for everyone. Putin is likely hoping that there'll be pressure put on Ukraine that may as well to come to the negotiating table because of the international imperative to focus on the Middle East crisis. There's been the revival of an idea that was a peace agreement on the table back in the spring of 2022, and a lot of talk around this issue, along with a lot of propaganda and a lot of misinformation and disinformation about the prospects for a negotiated solution. For Putin, it would be a win to have a partition of Ukraine on his terms. And of course that's the case. Like this idea that, this is horrible war, we need to get to the negotiating table now, only benefits Russia. Ukraine can go to the negotiation table when the Russians are severely on the back foot. And they haven't been put on the back foot because I don't think we have provided the right things at the right time for Ukraine to prevail. But that will happen. I'm confident that will happen. So we don't push for negotiation now. Putin has very clearly said over the last couple of days to his national public, we will only negotiate once we have achieved all our goals. In other words, once Ukraine is ours, then we'll negotiate. Well, Ukraine would already be yours by that point. It's kind of a moot point, isn't it, really? So the question now is, how does the war in Ukraine play into Putin's re-election bid? So she says it's pretty critical, but it's critical in that he has to have a win. Any Ukrainians who are in the occupied and partitioned territories of Ukraine will be forced to become Russians. We're already seeing that. It's not just the deportation and kidnapping, abduction of Ukrainian children from the conflict zones who are then being turned into Russians, literally, and in many cases through adoptions. But it's a fact that Ukrainians living in the occupied territories are being forced to take Russian passports and Russian citizenship to be able to get basic payments for their jobs, pensions, etc. Putin has already made it clear that he no longer thinks that there is a separate Ukrainian identity or language or heritage, and that Ukrainians are nothing but Russians. And this is what we've been seeing over the last few days. I've been reporting on it, how the occupied Ukrainians or Ukrainians in the occupied territories are being forced to take Russian passports on fear of deportation or losing their houses. So a partition of Ukraine is something that Putin will see as a major win, she says, because that will give him a platform to push back and later attempts to try for more. And because he will also have discredited the US politically and created a whole wave of knock-on effects internationally. So if he negotiates, so if you get people like Vivek Ramaswamy or Trump or whatever forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table, and then they negotiate some of their territory, Putin would be like, A, we've kind of won, but B, look how weak the US is. We have manipulated them to do our bidding, to do what we want. And that just puts the US in such a weakened position going forward. And as has already been hinted at, allies of the US will be like, well, if you're going to treat us like that when we get into a bit of a sticky situation, then I don't think you're the kind of ally that we were hoping for. It really does weaken the US. So this would greatly complicate Ukraine's ability to move forward and rebuild, says Hill. So Putin will basically say to Ukraine, you could have done all this, handed over these territories to us without hundreds of thousands of people dying, and then there will be a constant flow of Russian propaganda and influence operations against Ukraine in which Russians will accuse the Ukrainians of violating the ceasefire and manipulating negotiations and will stir up political strife. This will not end, it will go on forever. You just see what happened since 2014. I mean, that's exactly what happened from 2014 to now. All these arguments are an invasion with little green men, an illegal annexation, and then in the end, that's not enough. Let's, cooking up all this propaganda, flooding Ukraine with propaganda for all those years, and then invading again. That would just, rinse and repeat. It will be a great win for Putin because he'll be able to move on to the next part of the game while everyone else is stuck in place. He thinks in terms of bouts and tournaments, like the judo professional he was before in his youth. If he doesn't win the first bout outright, he might win the second and still move on to victory. And if Putin wins, there's, you've got this moral imperative. So we pushed Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons that it had inherited from the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. So the Budapest Memorandum, remember? And we gave assurances along with the United Kingdom and indeed France that Ukraine would not end up in the situation that it is in now. We guaranteed its territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence, and also assured Ukraine that we would step up to help. This opens up a whole can of worms related first to the moral jeopardy of this, that we obviously don't stick to our word. We promised to help them, gave them assurances in exchange for them giving up nuclear missiles, and what happens, we're arguing in Congress, or American lawmakers are arguing in Congress about whether they really should help. Well, actually, you signed up for that. You are kind of effectively contractually obliged to do so. And if you rescind on that, then, what does that say about the American word? But also there are proliferation issues. And this is an interesting, I'm not going to go massively into detail here, but she does talk about how it will give permission for all of these other nations who have nuclear aspirations around the edges. We've already got Pakistan and India and the problems there, but you'll have nations that are like, oh, we could do with some nuclear missiles ourselves, and Iran, and this will promote an era of nuclear rearmament. It's a real problem. If Putin wins and Ukraine is partitioned, there will be a nuclear proliferation race. And she says there's a very good chance of that there will be one. What do you say to Americans and members of Congress who feel like the money that we're using to help Ukraine would be better spent right at home? And this is where she speaks a lot to the kind of things I've been talking about over the last however long. Okay, that it's actually being spent at home, she says. That's the irony, because every time you send a weapon to the Ukrainians, it's an American weapon. You're not buying somebody else's weapons to go to Ukraine. It's also a fraction of our defense budget. It's a really circular process here. We're providing weapons to Ukraine. We're buying them from major manufacturers in defense systems here in the US, which are obviously providing jobs for the people who are making them. And we're going back and we're ordering more because we're replenishing and upgrading our own weapons stocks. This is all part of our own system. These defense manufacturers account for huge numbers of jobs across the whole of the United States. So arming Ukraine means significant job creation and retention across the United States and also in Europe and elsewhere. People in Congress know that. It's just that they're playing a different game. They want to play up this issue of it should be spent at home because of the transactional nature of congressional supplemental bills. And this is like, we want border security reform, etc., and we're going to have Ukraine aid as the transactional payment for that. What annoys me, it's like not any other thing, and we don't want clarity for objectives with Taiwan or with Israel. No, we're demanding that for Ukraine and Ukraine only. It's because either they don't want to help Ukraine because they've been poisoned by Russian disinformation, or they just realize that this is so important that they can use it to leverage this is so objectively important, but not so subjectively important for some of those representatives, right? So it's like, what's really important to me is what my base think, and my base want this, so I really want this. And I know objectively that Ukraine is more important, but it's not important for me and my job and my votes, or at least what I perceive as my electorate and what they want. So, yeah. Let's just put it frankly, she says, this is all about the upcoming presidential election. It's less about Ukraine, and it's more about the fact that we have an election coming up next year. The problem is that many members of Congress don't want to see President Biden win on any front. People are incapable now of separating off giving Biden a win from actually allowing Ukraine to win. So Ukraine winning is now part of Biden and his identity almost, and his electoral campaign. And so for many Republican voters and lawmakers, they say, yeah, I know it sucks for Ukraine losing, but actually it's more important that Biden loses. And if Biden is associated with Ukraine, then we will happily sacrifice Ukraine at the altar of the altar of Biden losing, right? And that may be the altar of Trump. So we'll sacrifice Biden and Ukraine to the idol of Trump or another Republican winning. And that's kind of what she's saying here. So people are incapable now of separating off giving Biden a win from actually allowing Ukraine to win. They are thinking less about US national security, European security, international security, and foreign policy, and much more about how they can humiliate Biden. And I'm going to come on to talk about this point because someone Andrew Perpetua placed a comment on my thread about that exact claim, which I think is interesting. So he contests that claim, and we'll go on to look at that, but he contests it in a very interesting way. So in that regard, whether they like it or not, members of Congress are doing exactly the same thing as Vladimir Putin. They hate that. They want to refute that, but Vladimir Putin wants Biden to lose, and they want Biden to be seen to lose as well. So it's almost like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Kind of thing going on there. For Putin now, Ukraine has become a proxy war. It's not a proxy war by the US against Russia. We're trying to get Russia out of Ukraine, period. But for Putin, Ukraine is a proxy war against the United States. To remove the United States from the world stage, he's trying to use Gaza and Israel like that now as well. He's trying to whip up anti-US sentiment wherever he can. I've just come back from Europe and from a whole host of conferences there where there's just so much rage and grievance about the United States, and Putin is fanning the flames. So this is the danger of Israel-Palestine conflict, and the US still supporting Israel with military aid and moral, diplomatic, political aid and support, that's so divisive that actually much of the rest of the world is then getting peed off with the US. And if Ukraine is very much like what I've just been talking about with Republicans, but with other countries and other political entities, that if Ukraine is associated with the US and the US is really annoying us over here with Israel-Palestine, then we hate the US, and therefore, by extension, we're then not bothered with Ukraine, or we put Ukraine in with the same in the same bucket as the US, and we Ukraine can go and do one as well. And Putin sees this, and he's fanning those flames of discontent. So he sees Biden as a major opponent. He's an obstacle for Putin to be able to win on the battlefield in Ukraine. I mean, obviously so. So Putin wants Biden to fail. Putin would be thrilled if Trump would come back to power, because it also anticipates that Trump will pull the United States out of NATO, that Trump will rupture the US alliance system, and that Trump will hand over Ukraine. So right at this particular moment, Putin sees an awful lot that he can get out of undermining Biden's position. Very interesting bit of news came out today that I think the Senate are going to table a bill that would not allow a single president, or would not allow the president to pull the US out of NATO, that it will have to go to a vote in Senate, which I think is a good check and balance to have there. She continues, not too much more now from Fiona Hill. I told you this is a big one. We have a situation now where perhaps Biden is the only person who can actually break the legislative logjam. Members of Congress and senators, many of whom I know from my own discussions with them, absolutely support assisting Ukraine and get the importance of this moment, still can't get past the domestic politics. So it's like, yeah, I understand that Ukraine is really important, but the southern border is more important to me. So I am going to use this leverage to get what I want, which I see as more important than the Ukraine issue. So Biden is going to have to somehow persuade them that if they rise to the occasion, helping Ukraine is not going to give him some kind of political boost and a consequential win. This is the best possible position that Vladimir Putin could possibly have. He's got no problems for his own election in March 2024. Is there seriously going to be any kind of opposition to him? He doesn't have the equivalent in the New York Times and Washington Post writing articles about how old he is, or how he might have tripped walking downstairs, or in the case of Vladimir Putin, how much Botox did he use this morning? There's no one trying to put his family on trial. There's no one digging into every little part of his personal and political history. Putin is just home free. That difference, of course, he lives in a dictatorship where he's got complete control of the press. So it's a home run for him to get elected. Whereas when you're dealing with political support for Ukraine, it's complicated by the idea, by the reality that every politician involved in supporting Ukraine is also involved in fighting for their own future, and fighting against character assassination attempts and political assassination attempts by opposition media. So Biden is fighting for Ukraine, but at the same time he's fighting against Newsmax and against OANN and against Fox News, right? Who are consistently bashing him, and all the Republicans are consistently bashing him, which is, that's no criticism per se. That's just the nature of a free democratic nation. Putin doesn't have that. It's so much easier for him to score these wins against Biden, or against any political figure who is essentially against Putin. So we're not doing anything to put Putin in political jeopardy. We're just fighting with ourselves all the time. And we can't see past that. Biden's got to try to help Ukraine, but can he get enough people to see past the election and also see the jeopardy we are in? We are in peril. We don't see it. There's such an anti-American wave that's out there in the world. People want to see America fail and pulled down to size. Ukraine has become a battlefield now for America, America's own future, whether we see it or not, for our own defensive posture and preparedness, for our reputation and for our leadership. So I guess the point here is that this is the time you'd want to see American politicians reach across the aisle, because Ukraine has become a proxy war for the US and its position in the world. And if Ukraine lose, then the US's position in the world is thoroughly degraded. But for many politicians in America, they would take that so they can get a domestic win. So they can win in their own lives, in their own kind of... There is it's the idea of like, yeah, I know that some of my electorate don't want this or want Biden to win, but I want Biden to succeed in Ukraine because it's important for the world. but that never gets done, because that just gets trumped by doing things for the benefit of my personal representative agenda, my lawmakers' agenda, and to do things for my electorate that are very much localized. And we get back to this issue that, do you know what, Ukraine loses in that toss-up. As I just think it's such a good statement. I'm going to read it again. Ukraine has become a battlefield now for America and America's own future, whether we see it or not, for our own defensive posture and preparedness, for our reputation and our leadership. American leadership is still very important, but other countries are starting to make plans for a world without us at this particular point. And you can be sure that Vladimir Putin or President Xi and many others will be pretty ecstatic if we give up on Ukraine. And that could happen just as soon as December or January, because if Congress goes home for the holidays without passing the supplemental and everyone's back in their constituencies, and there's a lot of stuff that can happen in their absence, in that vacuum, that void that we have created, everybody else in the rest of the world will be wondering not just where is America, but what on earth has happened to America. And if President Trump thinks he's going to be the leader of the free world when he comes back into office, well, think again. There won't be a free world to be leading at all. And that's not an overstatement. That's just a fact. National security ought to begin at the border of the United States. We shouldn't be fighting about it all the time. We've got ourselves dangerously polarized along partisan lines, even though most Americans are not that polarized on this particular issue. I think the majority of Americans can see the importance of Ukraine. The majority of members of Congress and the Senate, irrespective of party, can see this as well. But the dynamic in our domestic politics has gotten to the point of such friction that our own position in the world is imperiled. This is so important. I've just got goosebumps in how well she has elucidated that, and how much I think that is true. That, unfortunately, politics in the US is so partisan that you end up playing transactional politics, and you will give up what is objectively really important stuff to achieve things that outside of your own little bubble aren't so important, say on a global stage. So now we come to the end of the article, and you're probably very happy about that. Is Putin winning right now? And I've missed a whole bunch here just to get to the end. So he's about to win, and it's on us. We're at the point where it's on us. If we leave the field, then he will win. His calculation is that our domestic politics and our own interests override everything, and that we no longer have a sense of national security or of our role in international affairs. This is a moment for him to get rid of not just Pax Americana, but America as a major global player. The decision is ours. This decision is entirely ours. We're just falling all over ourselves to engage in self-harm at the moment. Ukraine shouldn't be a partisan issue. I just hope that people are going to be able to dig deep and realise the moment that they're in. Really important stuff here to be discussed, and that's why I spent so long on it. And I just want to add to that in terms of what Andrew Perpetua said. And now he came onto my thread, and thank you for doing so, Andrew. Said, I don't think it's about humiliating Biden, about what some Republican politicians are doing. And again, I'm reporting what Andrew Perpetua says here, but I do kind of agree with some of this. It is about Republicans losing 3 election cycles in a row over abortion, them knowing that they have no answer to the abortion issue. The presidential candidates who proposed a 15-week ban were the first kicked out the primaries, and now they're freaking out, trying to change the topic of conversation to literally anything else. This is a really good point. I just written an article on the Texas abortion debacle where Kate Cox, Ken, what's his name? The Attorney General in Texas has just struck down the lower courts, allowing Kate Cox to have an abortion on medical grounds, because basically the fetus has trisomy 18 and other complications. So basically it's going to die, and it's also could render her infertile. She's got 2 kids. She really wants this child. Her own health and her own life is in danger by having the baby, and the baby will die. That's just a fact. It will die. If not, if it won't be stillborn, it will most likely die in the first week or 2 after birth, and certainly won't live beyond a year. So Anyway, so she got permission to have an abortion, given that they've got these really strict abortion rules in Texas. And then that was then struck down by the Texas Attorney General, sitting on a very conservative Supreme Court in Texas. Anyway, the point is that in the long term, this doesn't bode well for Republican success electorally, because as we've seen, every vote that's happened in the last year since Dobbs happened, since the overruling Roe versus Wade, every single election that's been to do with that, the Republicans have lost. So it's been this one thing where they had this great victory in terms of repealing Roe versus Wade. But actually, most of the country, 70% of the country, were for Roe versus Wade. There's only that really vocal minority. And that has hurt them at the ballot box ever since. Now, they're looking at the 2024 elections and thinking, if the voting goes along those kind of lines, we're going to be in trouble. So if you get a mobilization of people who like women particularly, who are going to vote against Republicans on the basis of this, then we're in trouble. And this is what Andrew Perpetua is saying. So they're never freaking out. No, this is not a debate. I don't want to debate about abortion. I'm just talking about like campaign planning and strategizing. So he says they're freaking out and trying to change the topic of conversation to literally anything else. Also note what happened 2 days ago in Texas, and that's what I wrote an article on. Republicans can try to change the topic of the conversation, but it's always boomerangs back to the abortion policy. They're absolutely freaking out about this. It is a double whammy for them too. Not only is abortion wildly popular in the US, probably one of the single most popular legal questions outside of legalizing cannabis, and that might sound controversial because you hear so vehemently the pro-life voices, but actually at the ballot box and in the polls, it really is very is like, I think it was 70% pro-choice, but their evangelical base were one issue voters. They only voted on abortion with the aim of banning it. Now that is banned, those people just don't care about politics anymore, and they probably aren't going to vote. So Republicans destroyed their biggest supporters and awakened their greatest rivals. That is why they desperately want people to think the border is a huge problem. This is really interesting from Andrew saying, right, and I get this, and I totally agree with this last point. That last sentence is what this is all about, which is saying, sugar, we've actually, that's a double-edged sword, winning the Dobbs ruling that overturns Roe versus Wade, because actually that's deeply unpopular and we're going to lose at the ballot box. So how do we combat that? We need to find something else that's equally kind of divisive, but is going to get us a lot of support. And so that's why they are going hard in on the border. And that's why Ukraine and borders all being tied up, because this is their strategy for winning 2024. Then it gets really interesting here. There's this theory that the Democrats could turn that, and actually if they were to basically put all the reforms in that the Republicans want, this is really clever. I don't know if this is actually happening, whether you're going to see this happening, but it wouldn't surprise me, and it would be fairly clever. If the Democrats agree to everything that the Republicans want on the border, literally, if they just said, okay, we'll give you everything you've just asked for, then the Republicans would have nothing to campaign on in the 2024 election. So Biden would say, I've given you the economy, which if you look at all the economic stats, the economy is incredible for the Americans at the moment, all things considered, compared to any other nation. So they've got the economy sorted. If they then do all the border things that Republicans want, then that's all the border things sorted. And then that allows them to win in Ukraine. And then you have this comment here saying, it started to come around to the US electoral politics theory. If Biden releases too much aid now, he'll look like a hero, but voters won't remember it next November, so November 2024. If he waits, though, the October surprise might be a big Ukraine win. So then you could have, right, and this is probably a bit conspiratorial, but you could have the Democrats agreeing to everything on the border so that they can then release all the aid for Ukraine, and then wait till close enough to the election in November that they release all the aid for Ukraine. So it may be releasing the aid in a big way for spring, so that the spring-summer becomes this big success for Ukraine on the battlefield, and Biden goes, I've given you the economy. I've given you the border, and I've given you Ukraine. And then he says to Democratic voters who will then get out and mobilize about abortion, so to change like the Dobbs ruling back or something like that, that could be a really good platform for the Democrats. So you've got the Republicans going, man, what are we going to campaign on if the Democrats go with them on the border? They've got what other culture wars thing? Because they've got abortion, they've got the border. What else can they campaign on? It's really interesting. I mean, this is the kind of geopolitical stuff I absolutely love to talk about. There's some really interesting dynamics going forward here, and Biden could play some sensible politicking here. Or now you might argue it depends what your position is on immigration and the border, but you could see that there could be some interesting politicking from the Democrats that might leave the Republicans devoid of things to campaign on. I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm not trying to be like pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. I'm just trying to get inside both of their heads in terms of how do you win the election. So what's traditionally won the Republicans a lot of support is they try and campaign. They traditionally campaign very well. They've been much better campaigners. The Republicans are much better campaigners than Democrats. And they campaign on emotional issues. So they emotively campaign, and they try and win on the heart over the head. But the Democrats, worse at campaigning, try and win on rational policies, and they load it with policies and go, well, this. And it's interesting, it's what happened in the last couple of elections in the UK as well. So Boris Johnson campaigned on get Brexit done, and that was it. Get Brexit done. He just said that over and over. And it was campaigning on that, whereas the Labour manifesto was so long that the complaints were, you've got too much stuff in it. Stop trying to win people over with all these. It's all correct, it's all rational, it's all wonderful, it's all good stuff, but it's too much. People need simple, emotional stuff. Right, that's why you see the Republicans campaign so often on these culture wars issues. It's because they're emotive and they get people riled up and get them to the ballot box. And that's your emotional campaigning that Republicans are really good at. But if they had the rug pulled out from under them, and the Democrats give those things, and those things are already achieved, where do they go? Let me know what you think. I know I've gone on way too long, and I hopefully haven't annoyed too many Republicans here, because I think this is all kind of fair game discussion that I think is really interesting. But let me know if you think I've overstepped the mark. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.